Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about Star Trek TNG, and I want to try to rank all the episodes of the show to try to pick out my favorite episodes. I don't actually have any one specific episode which I can say is the best one. I think this show was good because it had a lot of good moments, even in bad episodes. However, I cannot call an episode good just because it had one very good scene. And so when I think about all the good moments in the show, a lot of them were actually in bad episodes. And a lot of those moments were much better than anything in what is considered the best episode, and so it's pretty hard to pick out the best episodes of the show. Some episodes were really good because they had a lot of good action, for example, but they didn't really have all those interesting or emotional moments, and so I don't really consider those episodes the best ones. They don't really represent the show at its best, in my opinion. So what I'm going to do now is go over the entire series and do a quick review of every episode and pick out the best episodes in each season, and maybe in the very end I will pick out my favorite episodes of the entire series. So let's get started. Season 1, I think everybody agrees, is the worst season in this show. Most of the episodes were not that great. Visually, it's not that great. If we look at it now, it's closer to the original series. The rest of the show looked much better. The acting got better, the stories got better, everything got much better from season 2 onward. And I think the show was really at its peak between season 3, 5 and 6. Season 7 started kind of losing good ideas, started doing all kinds of ridiculous episodes again, but anyway, I'll get to it. So let me go over each episode. So let's start with the first episode, Encounter at Farpoint. I think it did its job of introducing all the characters, this new Enterprise, the holodeck, Q. It introduced a lot of these things which we'll recall later, but this episode by itself wasn't really that well done, but I guess it was okay. Compared to season 1 it was probably better than average, but compared to the rest of the series it was probably below average in my opinion. Anyway, moving on, The Naked Now was the first real comedy episode. It had some jokes. I think it's an entertaining episode. One of the better ones of season 1. However, I think they probably did it too soon in the series. Like, before you even get to know these characters and how they act, normally you immediately throw them into this situation where everybody are drunk and behaving strangely, and immediately you have Wesley take over the ship and being an annoying kid. That was probably a mistake to do that so early in the season, because it kind of set up Wesley as an annoying character and all the other characters behaving strangely. They should have done this episode later on in the series, but I also think it does have some genuinely funny moments, and so that's why this is an above average episode in my opinion. But nothing great. The next one, Code of Honor, is probably the worst episode of the entire show. Absolutely terrible, almost unwatchable. And the next episode, The Last Outpost, was a little bit better, but still kind of iffy. It introduced the Ferengi, which I guess later on became comic relief aliens, but in this episode they weren't really funny. Maybe a little bit unintentionally funny, but not really. That wasn't intended as humor. They were actually supposed to be the big villains, so that's kind of laughable. And they had a mildly interesting story about that planet with that emperor-looking guy and all of that. So for its time, I guess it was okay. So I would say it's an average for season 1. The next episode, Where No One Has Gone Before, I think this is the first really good episode of season 1. The first one that really had that spirit of Star Trek, of exploring the unknown, going to some far reaches in the universe, and exploring something strange and bizarre, and also having that kind of mystery. I always love those episodes in which we don't know what's going on at first, and then later on we discover the secret, the mystery, and also that interesting science fiction idea that all their thoughts come true. That was done in a lot of science fiction shows, but I think probably one of the first time was in this one. It had a few funny moments, some interesting scenes, it had some good music, it had some good visuals for the time whenever they showed them going in those high speeds. That was really well done for its time. So I would say it's one of the better episodes of season 1. Next one is Lonely Among Us. It had that energy alien that was possessing people on the ship. The first of many. In this show we had a lot of aliens like that. Some kind of energy creature that invades the ship and starts going around the ship and possessing people. That idea was done kind of multiple times, but I like that idea. And in this episode it became fun when it possessed the captain, and then the captain started behaving strangely, and that was kind of funny. I used those in a lot of parodies I did later and so on. So this episode did have some good scenes, but nothing really outstanding, nothing really amazing, so I would say it's an average episode. The next one is the episode Justice, which I think is funny. I have a soft spot for this episode. It is kind of ridiculous, but in a good way. Like, it's an unintentional comedy, or even intentional, I'm not sure. It's a really hilarious episode. And it has some nice locations. The same place that later became Starfleet Academy is an alien planet here, which is funny, and all those guys running around almost naked and all of that. It's kind of that idea that a lot of Star Trek episodes had of that pleasure planet on which, there's free sex for everyone and a lot of beautiful women, they all want to sleep with you and all of that, and that's kind of the male fantasy, and that's common in a lot of Star Trek episodes, and this is one of the best examples. So I actually would put this episode slightly above average, even though it has a ton of problems. It has a lot of inconsistencies with other episodes. For example, the Prime Directive, even though it is part of the plot, they say they cannot intervene in the laws of the planet, but why did you even show up on that planet if they don't have warp drive yet, apparently? They don't seem to have any spaceships, and they seem to be meeting aliens for the first time. And when Picard beamed up that woman to the Enterprise to show her their god in space, she bowed to that god, and later she started bowing to Picard because she said she saw him up in space together with God, and that means he's God, and started bowing down to him. So that seems to indicate that these people never went up into space. This is the first time, and then that woman started thinking that Picard is her god. So isn't this exactly the type of situation you're supposed to avoid with the Prime Directive? So if these people are on that kind of level, then why did you even come to meet them? So it doesn't really make sense. I guess we can explain it away by saying that only that specific woman was like that. She was basically stupid, and that's why she thought so, and all the other ones didn't bow to Picard. They didn't understand that these are aliens, apparently. So I guess maybe someone made contact with them already, or they did have warp drive and simply weren't using it that much or something. So I guess we can make up some kind of excuse, but it does seem to be a kind of a contradiction with later episodes. And it's kind of like the prototype of a lot of ideas which were done much better later, like the idea of the planet Risa, the pleasure planet, which welcomes everybody, and the idea in Who Watches the Watchers, when those people thought Picard was a god and started bowing to him, that was done much better there. So this episode feels like a prototype of some of those ideas which were fleshed out much better later. But I still kind of like this episode. I find it funny, and Picard did have that good speech in the end in which he didn't want to sacrifice Wesley, and he said that justice is not just a rule book and all of that. So that's an example of those kinds of moments which I always say makes the show good. All those morality tales, all of those little speeches by Picard or other characters, and so this episode had some of that. That's why I would say it's slightly above average. Next episode is The Battle, which had that Ferengi that wanted to take revenge on Picard because Picard once killed his son. This is below average episode, Picard going crazy because of that device. Not really that interesting, nothing really special in this episode, so kind of weak. One of the weakest episodes in my opinion. Next episode is Hyde and Q. Q shows up again and starts toying with the crew. He teleports all of them to some planet. He offers Riker the powers of the Q. I never really liked this one. Most of the Q episodes in the show later on, all the other ones are pretty good episodes, but this one is not so much. This one is pretty weak, below average. All those scenes on the planet were pretty ridiculous, so nothing really good in this episode. The next episode is called Haven, which also I think is a weak episode. It had that arranged marriage that Troy was supposed to marry some other guy, and then Riker was jealous, and nothing really that good. Pretty bad episode, pretty awful in my opinion. I think that's the episode when we first met Loxana Troy, which I do think is a funny character, so that's the only redeeming element in this episode, that it introduced Deanna's mother, Loxana Troy, but other than that, nothing really funny or interesting in this episode. The next episode is called The Big Goodbye, and that was the first holodeck episode. You know how this show often did these episodes that take place entirely or almost entirely in the holodeck, and people always get stuck inside there and all of that. I talked about that in a whole separate video, and I complained about that. I said the holodeck is a nice idea, but it should probably been used just for short scenes or for comedy episodes, and not really use it as the main plot of an episode. I think it's not really that interesting compared to actually going to a planet, to an actual civilization, or to the past, and then you have to deal with all the morality issues of all of that situation. But when it's just the holodeck and everything just disappears in the end, then it's less interesting. And this is the first episode that did that, in which the A plot is inside the holodeck. And I just don't think it's that interesting long term. I think the holodeck should be reserved to specific scenes or to comedy episodes, like that Barclay episodes later, I'll get to it. That was a fun use of the holodeck. But I don't think it should be used to generate tension for the characters, because after a while it becomes stupid. Like how many times they get stuck in the holodeck and are in physical danger because the safeties are off. I mean, after a while it became really ridiculous. And so looking back, all those holodeck episodes seem to be kind of ridiculous and not interesting because there is no real morality story to all of it. It's just to survive the holodeck. And this one is a below average holodeck episode. Next episode is Datalore, which I think is interesting. They set up this villain character of Data's evil twin brother, which is kind of a corny idea. You know, it's been done in a lot of places. The idea of some character having an evil twin that at some point replaces him and then no one knows it's him. It was done in so many places, it's a little bit cheesy, but I liked it. It also gave Brent Spiner the chance to play a villain, and I think he's great playing villains. And Lore was kind of a creepy, psychotic, over-the-top evil guy, and that was kind of fun. So I think it's a fun, I always liked seeing Lore. And also the very idea of these two androids being so similar and yet so different is also kind of interesting to think about, because the difference is that Lore has emotions, and because he has emotions and he's more human, that also makes him evil, and yet Data, who doesn't have emotions, is much more innocent, he's much more childlike, and therefore he's kind of pure of heart, he's a very kind of innocent character, and Lore is the opposite of that. So I think that episode kind of really showed what Data might become if he becomes too human. There's a danger there as well, because humans have a dark side to them. And so I think that idea of Lore was a very nice idea, and I wish there were more episodes with him actually. And it's a bit strange how in the end of this episode they simply kind of threw him out into space, and it's kind of funny how no one ever bothered to come back and pick up Lore, because isn't he a sentient being? I mean, Picard even fought for Data's rights to be acknowledged as a sentient being, and yet no one ever cared about Lore. And you know, he didn't even kill anyone in that episode. Okay, I guess they said that he betrayed those colonists, and so he was guilty of all those thousands of people dying, but still, doesn't he deserve a trial? How can you simply throw him out into space? And if you know that he's not dead, he's not dying from that, so that's like condemning him to float in space forever. That's kind of a cruel and unusual punishment. And maybe that's a point he should have brought up later when he came back, because he was picked up by a Pac-led ship or something. And yet he never said that he wants revenge against the Enterprise or Data for leaving him there, which would have made sense for him to be angry about that, but he didn't really seem that angry about that. He just wanted to take over the galaxy with the Borg, I guess, and I'll get to that later. But Lore was a pretty nice villain in my opinion. It's a shame we got so few episodes of him, so I would say that Lore is an above average episode of season 1. Next we have the episode Angel 1, which was that episode about the females being in charge of that planet. The men are treated only as servants, and the women are the leaders. So that's a nice idea, which was also done in a lot of other science fiction shows. And there were a few funny moments in this episode, but other than that, nothing really that interesting. No real big moral dilemmas or stuff like that, so probably below average episode, even though it did have some good moments. Next episode is called 11001001, which is a neat episode. I think it's probably one of the best in season 1. First of all, it had those cool aliens who looked actually alien, because they picked short actors and they made him kind of like cyborgs, and they always go in pairs and they kind of talk with each other in that fast voice through their computer or whatever. And so I think those were actually cool aliens. It's a shame we didn't get more aliens like that, because they actually look alien. Unlike most aliens who just look human with ears or foreheads, these ones actually look kind of creepy and they behave strangely and all of that, so I loved those aliens. I also loved seeing the Enterprise docking in the starbase, that looked cool, and the story itself was interesting. It was kind of a mystery episode, which I always enjoy, not knowing what's going on at first, and it also involved the holodeck, because Riker got stuck in the holodeck, but at least in this episode it's explained. It was done by those aliens because they needed someone to save their planet, so they trapped Riker in the holodeck after modifying it to create a woman that he would fall in love with. And it's also the first example of someone falling in love with a holodeck character, which is also an idea they later explored in a lot of other episodes. And so I think this is a pretty neat episode, well above average, maybe one of the best episodes of season 1. Next we have the episode Too Short a Season, which I think was pretty bad. It was about that old admiral who came to the ship, and then he started aging in reverse. It's like Benjamin Button. Suddenly he started becoming younger and younger. And other than that, the episode was pretty boring, nothing really that interesting. Next episode is called When the Boat Breaks, which had that planet of Aldea, which was cloaked, and then it revealed itself, and then they stole the kids of the Enterprise because they are all sterile, and so they need to steal other people's children. Which reminds me of a TOS episode in which there was that planet with accelerated time, and they were also sterile, and so they had to steal people from other ships in order to reproduce or something, and so it's kind of similar to that. And so here they kidnap a bunch of children, including Wesley, and so a lot of the episode is all kinds of scenes with these kids. And I didn't hate it. I think most of those scenes were okay, not really annoying. And I never really hated Wesley. Like, he was annoying in a few episodes, but most of the time he was... I was a kid myself when I watched it. I was smaller than him, and so I found him to be a perfectly fine character back then. So I never really hated Wesley. I know a lot of people hate him as a character. I think he was fine most of the time. And in this episode, he's like the leader of that group of kids, and Picard has to find a way to save those kids. So I would say it's an average episode. A few neat ideas, a few neat scenes, a few funny moments, and a story which is okay. Next episode is called Home Soil, which was about that inorganic alien that lived on some planet on which the Federation was mining it, and it endangered that creature, and so it killed some of those people, and then Picard had to make contact with it. It's kind of that idea of Star Trek of making contact with some unknown alien and reaching an understanding, so I love that basic idea of it. The execution, however, wasn't that good. I think it's a pretty weak episode, definitely below average. The next episode is called Coming of Age, which was about Wesley Crusher going down to some planet to go through some tests to get into Starfleet Academy, and he's kind of too good at everything, so maybe that's why some people hated him. Now when I think about it, I realize that in a lot of ways Wesley was like the male Mary Sue. You know how I often complain in today's movies about Mary Sue characters who are good at everything, kind of too good to be realistic, and that can be annoying to people. And now that I think about it, maybe that's an example of why Wesley was a hated character, because he's kind of too perfect at everything. He's like totally moral, totally courageous, totally generous. Like, he has so many positive traits and not a lot of negative ones, and so it becomes an unrealistic character, someone with no flaws at all. That's like the male Mary Sue. It's like a Gary Stu situation. But I remember when I watched it as a little kid, I wasn't annoyed by any of that. In fact, I kind of looked at Wesley as kind of a role model, someone who is a good student, someone who helps other people. So as a little kid watching that, it was actually kind of inspiring. So that's why I don't really hate this episode, which showed off Wesley as being this amazing kid and all of that. But looking back at it now, I can totally understand why some people found him annoying. And there was another plot in which Remick and that admiral were investigating the Enterprise, and it had some comedic moments. That scene with Remick interviewing everyone, and it kind of cut from one to the other without you noticing, and they had some comedic timing in all of that. So I would say this is an average episode, kind of okay episode. Next episode is called Heart of Glory, which was the first Klingon episode of this series, and they had this new version of Klingons, which are very different from the way they were in the original series, and I think it's an improvement. I think this version of the Klingons is the best one from all the ones we got, so I do think it's better than in TOS, but it was kind of a little bit too over the top. It was kind of too on the nose, it was too much, kind of ridiculous, kind of unintentional comedy, so all those Klingons were kind of too animalistic, and they were not that way later on. They kind of made them more realistic later, so in here it's like, but it's kind of comedic, so I kind of like it, so it's kind of funny. And all those moments in which Worf has to prove himself to the other Klingons, to prove that he's still a Klingon, and all of that, that was done in later episodes as well, and it was done much better later. As I said, the show kept improving. So I would say this one is an average episode. It did have that whole setup of these new Klingons, which I like, and so I don't think it's a terrible episode, but it didn't really have any good ideas. It had only those two Klingons on the ship, running around causing chaos, but nothing really much beyond that, and so I guess it's a slightly below average episode because it didn't really have a good story. The next episode is called The Arsenal of Freedom, which I remember I really liked as a kid. They were down on that planet, and then they had those flying robots chasing them around and all of that, and Picard meets the hologram, who is played by the same guy who played that ghost in the movie Ghost. He was that guy in the train station. I remember it as kind of a fun episode. It had that scene of Riker being interrogated by a hologram of his old friend, and then it turns out to be one of those robots. And it has that kind of story of a civilization which was wiped out because they had too much technology, which is a neat science fiction idea. So I do think this episode had a lot of neat moments, and so I don't think it's a terrible episode, even though the execution of the special effects and all of that didn't age well. And it had that subplot of Geordi being in command of the ship, and he's scared, he's not confident, he's been challenged by other officers, and then Troy helps him overcome that. It was nice seeing a character who has to overcome a challenge, and so Geordi had trouble commanding the ship, and then he overcame that and became a good commander, so that was also a nice touch to the episode, and so I would say it's maybe slightly above average episode compared to the rest of season 1. The next episode is called Symbiosis, which I think is an interesting episode because it had that idea of one planet being basically enslaved to the other because it got addicted to a drug that only the other planet can provide, and then they provide them with everything else, and basically one planet gets rich of the other. And this is the kind of situation that we can use to discuss real politics and stuff like that. So this is like using science fiction as a metaphor to real social issues, and so I kind of like that. I always like those elements in Star Trek, and even just as a science fiction idea, and also with the whole idea of the Prime Directive, of Picard not being allowed to tell them the truth, but in the very end he kind of found an elegant way to still do the right thing despite of the Prime Directive. And as I often say, the Prime Directive is pretty stupid a lot of times and very inconsistent. I mean, if it only is meant to protect primitive planets, then why does it apply here in which both of these planets have starships? So why does the Prime Directive even apply? Why cannot they simply tell them the truth? But I did kind of like that ending in which Picard still did the right thing for everybody without violating the Prime Directive. He kind of used the Prime Directive for his advantage to actually do the right thing, and so I kind of liked the way that Picard always kind of finds legal loopholes to still do the right thing despite the circumstances. And so I did like that part of it. Those aliens had those cool powers of grabbing people and electrocuting them and all of that. So I remember as a kid I thought that was cool, and so I would say this is an above average episode. Maybe even one of the better episodes of this season in my opinion. The next episode is called Skin of Evil, which was about that liquid alien that killed Tasha Yar. And I really like that alien because, first of all, finally we get to see an exotic alien with practical special effects, not just some energy creature, but actually a physical creature and kind of a shapeshifter, kind of the precursor of Odus people, made up of liquid, but he can assume any form he wants, kind of like the Founders later, and so I really love that idea. And they did it mostly with practical special effects, and so it looks very real because it is real, it was made from real materials, and so it looks great even by today. And so I really love that alien, and also killing off a major character was also, I think, a good thing because it kind of shook things up. It showed everybody that there are real stakes in this show, that characters can actually die and stay dead. And also I think Tasha Yar was kind of a weak character, so getting rid of her was probably for the better. And I don't blame the actress because it was mostly the fault of the writing. They really didn't give her much to do. Maybe if she would have stayed, they would have done much better, but I think getting rid of her and promoting Worf to be security chief, that was kind of a better spot for him than just being somewhere in the background as a science officer or whatever he was in the beginning. So I think him being the chief of security was the perfect spot for him, and so Tasha had to kind of move aside for that. So in many ways that did actually kind of improve the show. And I remember as a kid I really thought Armos was a cool villain. He was an exotic alien, and we even had a scene of Picard kind of lecturing to him and all of that, and Picard is really the best character to deliver all kind of moral lessons to people and to aliens, and so that also is a nice touch. And so I would say it's a pretty good episode for season 1. And the next episode is called We'll Always Have Paris, which also I think is a neat episode because it had a lot of interesting science fiction moments, like all those time loops, all those times that they saw themselves from a few seconds in the past and all kinds of stuff like that. And it had that mystery thing going in which you don't know what's going on at first, so I always love those mystery episodes and something weird going on, kind of like a Twilight Zone situation. And that guy describes what he saw in another dimension, and they never show us that, but he only kind of describes it, which was a neat way not to do any special effects. They did that a lot in the original series. I remember some character would simply describe something amazing that he's seeing or that he experienced without actually showing that, so it's a kind of a neat way to deliver something cool without actually showing it, and in some ways it might even be better because that way our imagination can work a little bit. So sometimes it's even better that way. So I think it's a nice episode, and I always enjoyed all those strange, weird situations and the time loops and all of that. That kind of stuff is what makes science fiction interesting. And I didn't like that subplot of Picard's ex-girlfriend and all of that, and it didn't really tie into the main story in any way, so this is the weak spot of the episode, but I did love all that science fiction-y weird stuff going on, and that's why I think it's one of the best episodes in season 1. And the next episode is called Conspiracy, and I remember as a kid this was one of my favorite episodes of the entire show, because I really loved the creepy factor in it. I love those aliens that possess people, basically just like the Goa'uld later in Stargate. They played around with that idea a lot more, and in TNG it was only done in this one episode. And it was also like a mystery episode that you don't know what's going on at first, and it's like paranoia, you don't know who to trust, and there's the conspiracy in Starfleet, and later in the end we find out the Starfleet leadership was possessed by these aliens, and then we had that epic scene in the end of Picard and Riker simply running around and phasering all of them and blowing up all their heads, and we see all the aliens coming out and all of that, and that is just so cool. And so that's I really love this episode as a kid. It's probably the goriest, most bloody episode of the entire show, and I think it's a plus. I think that was great, and I still think it's a great episode, maybe even the best one in season 1. I wouldn't say it's the best one of the entire show, and also it's not really in that spirit of Star Trek. It's not really a Star Trek type of story. It doesn't have a moral dilemma. It doesn't have negotiating with the aliens and making peace and all of that. It's basically blowing up their heads, which is not in the spirit of Star Trek, but I think once in a while it's fine to do that. It's fun. And so I would say it's probably the most entertaining episode of season 1. And the next episode is called The Neutral Zone, which reintroduced the Romulans as the big villains, which is also important because later on in the show the Romulans were like the big recurring villain. And this episode kind of started that, and it also had another plot about waking up those people from their cryogenic sleep, and they're from the 20th century, basically from our time, and then they have to get used to this new future. And this episode also had that lecture by Picard, which is basically like a communistic lecture about money not existing and all of that, which of course the later seasons kind of contradicted, because all of them obviously do have possessions, they obviously do have their private property, they do trade with other people or with aliens to get certain things, and so this whole speech by Picard is a little bit kind of pompous. This first season had a lot of those kinds of moments which had like good intentions behind them. I can understand the intention, which is to show that bright future, that idealistic society in which everybody works because they want to work, they want to contribute, and they're not greedy or selfish, and so that's a nice idea. But in a lot of scenes they had that pompous attitude. Like in one episode, like Riker was saying humans no longer eat meat if it's not replicated and all of that, and of course later on in the show it was all contradicted. And so looking back at season 1, it's a little bit kind of silly. One of my excuses for that was that the timeline changed, that certain things changed later on because of all the time traveling. For example, when the Enterprise C went into the future and back, and it took Tasha Yar with them from the different timeline, and then it changed this timeline, and then Tasha Yar's daughter appeared on the show. That basically means the first 2 seasons are in a different timeline to everything that came out later. So maybe we can use an idea like that to try to explain away these inconsistencies, and that's something I talked about in the different videos. But this episode, The Neutral Zone, I think it's okay, it's entertaining, it has some funny moments. It's fun to see the reactions of the people of today to all the weird stuff on the Enterprise, so that the woman sees Worf and then she faints, that other guy is fascinated by Data. So this episode does have a lot of fun moments, but I cannot really say it's a good episode. It's like an average episode. So I think from all of season 1, my favorite episode is still probably the episode Conspiracy, simply because it was so fun. And I just love that whole creepy element of it, and it kind of builds up and up and up until that showdown in the end. So I think that's a great episode. So that's it for season 1, and I guess I'll do a separate video for each season. Otherwise it will just be too long. So I will review season 2 in my next video. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.